While the PowerPoint is being sorted, I should also add I never ever planned on being an academic. And I have more than enough years of being stuck in the kitchen, having the chef shout at me at 2 a.m. in the morning, ask me why the kitchen isn't finished, and more than enough time working in the industry to tell you that the customer is not always right. But I do have my customer smile to reassure you. I give you that background partly because of context. In talking about destinations, I want to provide a wide perspective. I am not just providing a perspective of an academic or someone who's been in the industry and also someone who worked for a senator in Australia. So I also understand the problems that politicians face. And in one sense, those multiple roles are the problem of destination planning and destination marketing and management. Because one of the problems we have, I think is the central one, is that when we talk about improving destination planning or improving our plan, it's actually a code for finding some kind of solution to all the interests we have in a destination. And the big question, of course, is it possible? And the realistic answer is often no, it's not. And that's something which is very hard for many people to deal with. Or if you do want to try and satisfy as many people as possible and find consensus, it actually takes much more time than what the system normally allows. And that is whether it's the business system and coming up with results in the next quarter, or let's be honest, for many small businesses, the next customer, or whether it's for the politician in order to know, okay, we have an election coming up, I want to be re-elected. In order to try and do destination planning and management for that kind of time context is extremely hard. But it also raises some very big questions. What on earth is it we want to do? Because usually when we talk about destinations, we use the sustainable word and we also use the competitive word. Are they compatible? Are they really compatible? And I want to pose some hard questions which I don't necessarily have the answers for, or you will not like the answer. But I think it's the kind of blunt conversation you really need at meetings like this, and which you don't normally have in public enough, because you usually have it in some side door afterwards, rather than being in public. So, can these things be integrated? What are we looking at? One of the problems that we find with tourism planning or destination planning per se is that often it's only a major concern of tourism research stakeholders or tourism industry stakeholders. And to be quite honest, apart from some very, very specific locations, tourism policy actually is not that important for tourism. What is much more important is policies with things like, how is the exchange rate set? Because in fact, it's the exchange rate which determines in the bigger picture how successful you are with international tourism, not your tourism policy, not your marketing strategy, it's the exchange rate. Transport is clearly important. Land use is clearly important. How does tourism fit in with that?
10.
And one of the problems that we have is that planning actually finds it very, very hard of dealing with tourism or anything that's mobile, because it's much easier to control something that's in the same the same spot. I'm Australian, I swear a lot. The same spot the whole time. If people are mobile, they're very hard to control, and most planners and policymakers hate that. It's true. The other problem we have, and this is a generalization in most parts of the world, is that tourism is still not regarded as a serious industry. Always with that serious industry feel. And I think that's maybe be overcome at times of economic crisis for a short term, but in the long run it's still a problem we have with policymakers. You may or may not have that problem here in Iceland, I don't know. Also, we have a concern with the environment. And so what I want to do is raise significant questions about the value of much of what passes as destination planning and policy as opposed to a bigger picture, more integrated regional planning and policy? What is the value of research? I think there is a value, and the one thing, and I haven't been paid to say this, that the Iceland Tourist Board is great at is the information that's available. It's about almost the only national tourism board in the world that has some surveys on sustainability in it available. That is fantastic. Because you can start actually comparing and contrasting what does this data do. But the thing is, of course, you can have the best technical planning stuff, all the best data in the world, and that doesn't necessarily mean you make the right decision, because what's the decision-making process? How inclusive is the policy and planning process? To what extent do you or will you be involved in the new policy that's been announced? Because if you don't have ownership, with due respect to the Minister, that policy is not worth anything. And I'm sure the Minister completely understands the issue of trying to get community and industry ownership of those kinds of things. Also, what real effect do such strategies have? What real effect? Visitor numbers? I actually think they have little effect with visitor numbers, to be honest. I do. Other things are much more important. Now, I'm not saying they're not useful. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that in really affecting visitor numbers, other things are often more important. They may be helpful for allocating capital or deciding how best to allocate capital. That is one of their benefits, I think. Marketing and branding, I'll be quite honest, I actually think that most destination marketing isn't worth the money that's spent on it. Whoa, that's popular. Now again, I think it makes a difference at the margin, but the problem we have, as you all appreciate, is that most of the images we have of destinations have been stuck there for years. I remember being in Scotland, I think it was the first national conference, was it 2001, 2002? And Scotland announced a new brand and a new campaign. I thought this would be interesting. What came out? The tartan, the bagpipes, the golf. But fair enough, how do you shift? In the case of Iceland, what do we have? Crisis, Arnie Sagnuson, horses, what else? Snow. It's an interesting issue, isn't it? What are you differentiated by? And please do not say you want to be another New Zealand or I'll throw up. Especially because New Zealand is not 100% pure. And I'll come back to those kind of issues. And you have a real issue in the long term of there being realism between what you have as your brand and what people believe and what you actually provide in terms of the experience and the services. I think that's incredibly important. And of course, how do you get collaboration? Very importantly, what do we mean by destination planning? And it depends where you stand. The problem is, in most cases, destination planning is seen just in terms of the tourism industry and it's our destination. That kind of thing. Bad mistake. Especially because in many cases, the tourism industry, and I'm here talking about those who see themselves as, say, the major carriers, the major transport players, the 100% accommodation providers, not the small players, they often see themselves as being the ones who know about tourism. But of course, there are other players as well, national parks, government, very, very important, the lifestyle businesses. Those farms, for example, for which tourism is an important part of their product, incredibly important, usually underplayed by much of the mainstream industry. Why are they important? Well, they're the ones who soak up high seasonal demand for a start, and they also tend to be the most innovative part of the sector, and they'll also throw in, they're the ones who also tend to provide the best experiences for people. Because they're the ones that allow the visitor to look backstage and see what really happens when they go somewhere. I think they're incredibly important, and they are often, I don't know the situation here, they are often left out of many strategies. They're often left out because some other players don't regard them as serious enough. But then we also have other sectors and firms. And for me, I think this is where the really good thinking needs to start coming. So how often does the tourism industry get in the same room as the food sector? Because the food sector is such an important part of Iceland's branding. How often does it happen? I can judge not very often by some of the reaction. Yet this is, I'd actually say, to be quite honest, that most people around the world probably understand more about Iceland in terms of image, in terms of food products they purchase from here than they do about tourism or tourism promotion. It's an indirect form of national branding, same as Scotland and whiskey. But really critical, also it's critical for regional development, because this is where your linkages occur. How much of an emphasis is there when you go to accommodation here in Iceland that you actually also are eating local food rather than something that's been imported from elsewhere? And very, very importantly, the people and the communities that make up the destination. How often are they involved? These are the people which provide the local colour, to use some phrasing that's sometimes used. Did you ever ask them whether they want to be sold as part of a tourism product? Because if you genuinely want to get them on site as your brand ambassadors, to use that kind of language, that's what you have to do. They have to be involved, and you need to be seeing tourism and tourism destinations in a much, much more integrated fashion than what usually occurs. But this is complex, it's difficult, it's hard. And it depends where you stand on what you think about this kind of stuff. If you're looking to have good destination planning for a start, do you agree from the beginning how to measure what you're doing? And it's not just having a measurement, it's agreeing on what you measure. They're slightly different. You have to agree on what's important to measure. Then you can start finding common ground. But that common ground, getting together in the same room to have a tea or a beer or whatever together, it takes time, it takes effort, and it has to be transparent. You have to be able to create trust. Whether you have politicians involved at local or national level, it has to be transparent. No hidden interests. And the problem is, because it takes so much time and effort, as I said before, it doesn't often fit into normal business and political schedules. And this also creates issues for sustainability. At one level, sustainability is incredibly important. It's incredibly important and incredibly successful. It becomes part of the language of tourism. It's just about every tourism plan you will see, whether it's public or private, will mention something about sustainability. The problem is, in real terms, if we're being honest, tourism is less sustainable than ever. It is less sustainable than ever. There are more emissions in absolute terms at a global scale. So, for example, just to give you the current rate, you probably already know, international tourism is increasing at a rate of about 4% per annum. The most optimistic forecast of increased efficiency in aviation transport sector is just under 2%. Hello, there's a gap there. So in absolute terms, not per tourist terms, but in absolute terms, there's more emissions occurring from tourism at a time when there's demands, especially with the Paris conference coming up, of having less emissions in real terms. It also uses more resources. It also contributes to biodiversity loss as well as conservation. How does it contribute to biodiversity loss? Introduction of species for a start. And it's interesting, coming into Iceland, I see very little biosecurity control, which I find really interesting given the farming base of the country. And I think that's an issue in terms of biodiversity loss. But also there's the longer contribution to climate change. And in many ways, although we often argue that tourism is a smokeless industry, in many ways it's no different from any other form of industrial development. It just looks cleaner because we avoid some of the hard issues and questions. And in fact, I would argue that much tourism growth in real terms, if you include considering natural capital, is actually uneconomic because it's running down natural capital. But do we actually care? And this gets us back to Tourism 101 and why. Now, we often forget that To get to any destination, whether national or regional, you have to get there and come back. That contributes to the environment. The problem is, most of the ways we always think, or most governments always think, about pollution and the environment is just what occurs at the destination. Of course, our dirty little secret in tourism is that we don't include the emissions of people coming here or going from. They are not included, I would bet, in consideration of the emissions here in Iceland. They're certainly not in New Zealand. In the case of New Zealand, you have a European traveller coming to New Zealand for 100% clean, green, pure experience or whatever, and 95% of their emissions is getting there and getting back. Gosh, how environmentally friendly that is. But we don't like to talk about it or want to talk about it because it really affects the image. That really is tourism's dirty little secret. And it's a major problem. And it's a major problem because it depends what our other destinations are doing in terms of their positioning. And in fact, there's an even bigger problem. In many ways, the problem isn't peak oil. Post the Paris meeting, assuming that there is going to be some kind of agreement on limits of emissions, the problem is going to be peak carbon. How much can you continue to emit? That really is the challenge for aviation and the cruise ship industry, which is another dirty industry. It's a real problem. And then we can think about issues of place competitiveness. And I'll come back to sustainability as well, but how do we bring this together? What are we competing for? The reality is, if we look at the bigger picture, we're competing for mobile people. But here, tourism should be integrated with a bigger picture, because we're also trying to appeal and attract migrants, capital, students, all of whom are mobile. We're also looking to attract mobile capital, let's be honest. And our tourism promotion and our overall national promotion and what we do on the ground affects whether or not we will attract those things. And just as importantly, do we retain people and capital? Because as the world is more mobile, not only can people come here so they can leave as well. Here, accessibility is very, very important. Tourism is not random. It depends on access. Everything depends on access in one sense. Place marketing there is significant because it can change perceptions of how accessible you really are. But, very, very important question, can you treat a destination or a place in the same way as a firm? And my answer is no, you can't. You can't. You do, but you shouldn't. When we're talking about firm competitiveness, we can usually talk about price competitiveness. The last thing you really want to be talking about in destination terms in one sense is just price. But the problems you then have in terms of competitiveness is often you just like some kind of code to legitimate I call it the neoliberal agenda, free market agenda, however you want to describe it, without looking necessarily at the big picture. And that's a really important issue for regional economies and peripheral economies. And I live in one. And so, therefore, you have a situation in which this notion of competitiveness is often referred to in policy statements, but most people do not know what on earth it means. It sounds good. But do you really, really know what makes up competitiveness? Because the problem is, with most of the stuff about place and destination competition, it's been turned like a bit of a Premier League, and the World Economic Forum are one of the biggest problems here. But you have other, these league tables of the most attractive, the most livable. Yeah, a load of crap. And it really is crap. But it's crap that gets believed. Why is it crap? One of the things I learned at university, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. However you set your parameters will determine the answers you get, right? So therefore, you change your parameters slightly of trying to see what makes up competitiveness, and you get different answers. And you can look at different league tables and different statements and get different answers. And the problem you have, I'm not saying it happens here, but in many parts of the world, When some of these league tables come out, it just gets regurgitated by in some press release by someone without even thinking what it really means. Don't believe the hype, I guess is the message I'm giving there. And if you actually go to some of the academic stuff on this, they even say, look, you know, in most of these kind of statements about competitiveness, including the World Economic Forum, the methodology sucks, to use a technical term. It sucks. You're dealing with fuzzy concepts. They're messy. And they're often regurgitated as well by consultants because it's the kind of crap they sell too. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that thinking about these aren't important. It is useful to think about it, but to what extent are you aware of what goes into thinking about being competitive? What are you including? And if I go to the regional studies literature, one of the things that becomes really, really significant is thinking about what we might call low road and high road policies. Tourism, unfortunately, usually gets caught up in a low road approach, which means not really differentiating yourself. What you usually end up doing is building another stadium, convention centre. What else can you think of? Visitor information centre, another road which you maybe didn't need, but maybe others were telling you you did or something, that kind of thing. Why? I'm not saying infrastructure is not important, but how does it fit into the big picture? And fundamentally, if we are going to use that language of being competitive and differentiating yourself and adding value and all that kind of words, what is the most important is the intellectual capital of tourism. That is the most important. That's what makes you competitive. It has to. Because as most of you know, one of the hardest problems you have in the service sector is protecting your IP. Because anyone can copy what you do the following season or sometimes earlier. You know that's a problem that we have, yes? And so in order to compete, you have to outsmart the opposition continually. That's one of the realities of tourism. So don't get bound up in low road strategies. I know politicians, I used to work with one, so I'm not being rude to the minister here. I know politicians love having a building or a ribbon they can open. There's that need for better opportunity, but it's not just about what you build. It's about the culture. It's about your education levels. Ultimately, that becomes part of being a smart industry. And one of the problems that we have is that there's often an assumption that because tourism occurs somewhere, then it must constitute development. Wrong. There's a difference between sustainable growth and sustainable development. Sustainable growth is a quantitative measure. Sustainable development is a qualitative measure. You should be after sustainable development and thinking about the qualities, the things you want from tourism. In general, not just for your business, not just for your individual community, but as part of the bigger picture. Or a destination. And that then means thinking about the things that often gets forgotten. What's the opportunity cost of what you use to invest? What else could it be used for? What about linkages? What's the pattern of firm ownership? That's an important issue, because that will influence how much money stays in the economy. What's the network relationships? Those kinds of things. And most importantly, what do we want to achieve? And how often are those regions and communities engaged openly in that debate? Not just at election time, but as part of planning. And it then raises the question, I'm starting to move down towards the end here before I get a look from the referee. Can places succeed with tourism? Some are going to be better positioned than others for reasons of accessibility. But accessibility, though important, isn't everything. What about your intellectual capital? But it also means asking, what do we want in economic terms? It's not just about people traveling through. It's not just about that at all. In fact, that's the biggest problem. So many times I've gone to places and they're telling me, we have several 100,000 people come down this road every year. Yep. How many of them stop? Well, yeah, people have to stop. Basic. Just having the numbers isn't it. You want to get them to stop, and you want them to get them to spend. And in many regions of peripheral areas, even to get them to stop for a small amount of time may be sufficient for what the community needs. Now, it may be more, but often if I talk to peripheral communities, what they want from tourism is to ensure that it helps maintain public transport, is to ensure that it also helps keep the store going and keeps people in the village and keeps a bit more employment. That's a good start. We can grow from there, but that's a start. Also, we can think about other issues though. I apologize for the jargon, space-time prison. It basically means if someone is on a trip, how far can they go? How far can they go? And as soon as they do a stop, it then means the next place they could stop hasn't been gone to. There's an attraction shadow. If you stop somewhere, I've got toilets up there, I'll come back to them. If you stop somewhere, go to the toilet, go have a cup of coffee, that usually means you won't go to the toilet again for, depending on your weather, about 1.5, 2 hours. Yeah? Really, actually, it's really important. And we can come up with some very nice models of the implications of that for how dependable your destination or attraction is. And that brings me to the toilet stop. It's one of my hobby horses. It's never usually talked about at meetings like this, and I'm going to. It's probably the most important thing in tourism. Let's be honest. It really is. You need to have good toilets. Otherwise, you literally have shit along the road, which is a problem in New Zealand from freedom camping. There's a problem in New Zealand from freedom camping. How good are your toilets? And I understand that I think there's a fund that provides up to 50% to municipalities. Not enough. It should be close to 100%, Minister. It really should be. And it's so important. And if you get people to stop at a decent toilet stop and have a decent cup of coffee, their experience just increases hugely. The toilet stop is essential, absolutely essential, in more ways than one. And it's about getting people to stop. It can be the toilet. And I have to add, this picture of a camel is from Sweden. And as you can imagine, I had to stop and take a picture of a camel in Sweden. Or you can have the experience of being in Australia and looking at the emu and then eating it. And I realise you can have similar experiences, not with emu, here in Iceland, whether it's whales or sheep. But fundamentally, it's about staying longer and spending. And here, think about mobility in the big picture. Think about tourists. Think about the second homeowners. Think about the seasonal workers. Thinking about students. If I'm arguing from a national perspective, I think much more money can be made from international students than they can be from tourists in the long term. Mobile, stay long. Very useful. And very, very importantly, and usually not sexy enough for much tourism marketing, visiting friends and relations. Having the Icelandic diaspora coming back regularly. They should be your most dependable market. They really should be, especially generations on for an ancestor experience. So, how do we do this? Short term, we look at retaining the spend. That means thinking about cooperation. It means about thinking about local purchase. It means about knowing how expenditure actually circulates through the local economy. Emphasizing the local is good because it reinforces brand and helps the economy very nicely. In the medium term, it's about developing networks. It's about focusing on creating trust and understanding, not pieces of paper. I cannot emphasize that enough. It is not about the piece of paper. It is about getting in a room and talking with each other over time and getting commitment and ownership of the policy. That is what is integral. And that's what will make it work or die. You may have champions as part of that or keystone firms, but do you know who they are? But it takes time. But in the long term, it's about developing capital and thinking beyond tourism. Do not just swap the dependency on one economic sector for tourism. Bad mistake. Destinations, places need diverse economies, and tourism must be a means to an end, not an end in itself. I'm arguing that from a destination perspective. If you were arguing from, if I was asked to argue from individual business, I'd say something different, obviously, but I'm not. But from a destination perspective, that's the question you need to be posing. And in fact, actually, from a business perspective, you should be posing it because you are embedded in communities. They are the people that ultimately make your product work. How often do you ask them, what are you doing right? How often do you have an open day with that when your local community can come see your product for free or experience it? They're your ambassadors. Make it work. So the answer depends on the question. To be successful, realistic, think about the issues, integrate, social and intellectual capital. More importantly, I think, in the bigger picture than infrastructure. But again, infrastructure is important. But unless you've got the capital right in terms of the intellectual capital, the infrastructure is useless. And it's about thinking about staying along as possible. Increased accessibility does create new issues. And that creates other problems. Making sure that the locals still feel like they're in control, I guess, would be the bottom line. So, can destinations become sustainable? Depends how it's defined. And here we get to the issue of a reduction in the drawdown of capital. An old-fashioned idea which Icelanders should be familiar with from the fishing industry, making sure you have a sustained yield. And that means not just thinking about efficiency, but thinking about sustainable consumption as well. You need both. You need to be understanding what you can do better in terms of efficiency and the resources you use, and thinking about consumer behavior. And this then brings some hard questions. Should you be limiting visitor numbers? I hear so much stuff about sustainability, yet there is not one destination I know of that is seriously considering limiting numbers, apart from very, very small parks or anything like that. It's about, therefore, thinking about length of stay. But most importantly, it's actually getting away from numbers per se and thinking about yield. What is the yield per tourist? Not just in your business, but as a country. How much does it really cost us? And therefore, are some markets better than others? That may mean that short-haul international markets, especially at a time of becoming concerned with carbon, becomes much, much more important. And I will be controversial here. Why bother with the Chinese? To give you an example, colleagues and I did a paper looking at New Zealand, and we looked at what would happen if we had a 5% drop in the UK market and a 5% increase in the Chinese market. Money stays the same, and we actually had a drop in emissions from tourism of around 15%. In the long term, they may be the kind of issues you have to deal with. I'm obviously not saying ignore the Chinese market, but I'm saying think smart in the future we're going to be having. Think smart. Think taxes. Do we tax appropriately? Do we offset appropriately? Do we charge the tourists for the resources they consume? Or is there just a huge environmental subsidy which the public have to pick up rather than the private sector? What funds are available for transfer from central government to regions to deal with these populations? That is a real issue. A colleague and I in Sweden did some work on this a few years ago, which the provinces got very interested in, because we looked, for example, at second homes and their distribution, and how in real terms, with how long people stayed in the second homes, what the real population of those places were. You could throw tourists into that mix as well and get a much better appreciation of how many people are there really in a location over a year. Because that is what some resource transfers should be based on. It can be done actually really quite easily these days. And I think it's going to be realistic in thinking of how to fund toilets, and sewerage. That's the kind of issue you need to be dealing with. What's the real population by the time you have the second home occupancy, the seasonal workers, and you add the tourists into some location as well as the local people? And then it gets to behavioural change. Are there things there we can do to improve the situation? But finally, and my last comment before the red card comes out, fundamentally, it's about dealing with political and business thinking, which is usually based on short-termism. I'm not making that as a comment to the minister. It's a general comment from my observations of being involved with planning around the years for the last 20 years from wearing different hats. Ultimately, you have to deal with short-termism and you have to be involved in a process and commit to a process. And that means being willing to challenge and to change, not just accept what the status quo is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall, for this quite refreshing presentations that you gave us today. We now have some time for questions. So please give a signal if you want to raise a question, and we'll have microphones coming your way very quickly. I'm sure you have lots of questions.
No, I can escape to the pub now.
No questions?
You can email me afterwards.
Well, I have one question. Yeah, of course I do. I would like to know who should drive the development of a sustainable, competitive destination. Is it the private sector or is it the public sector?
It's everyone.
Everyone.
But the problem is, and it really is the problem, how do you create an environment where the private sector is able to think long term? And look, people in the private sector, many of them are incredibly committed to the environment. The problem is they have the issue of day-to-day survival of their business. That is the problem. And look, I'm not just saying this as someone who has a small farm as well. I understand, and my academic job subsidizes the farm. I mean, that is the problem that you have. That really is the problem that we have. And I've been thinking a lot about this recently. And this could be a bit controversial. But I think one of the things we need to do that in many countries is a livable wage. And I think we need to have a good welfare system to be able to provide the support to allow people to move between jobs over seasons and to, if you like, if the business goes arse up or fails, to adjust. You need that in place. I mean, if you're going to be innovative and entrepreneurial, I think the state has a role as a safety net. And I have no problem whatsoever with there being a welfare system in place and a livable wage in place that allows people to take risks. You need to be able to take risks, yeah? Okay, but you also, if you have families, you also need to be able to make sure you've got something you can fall back on. And I think it's the system, stupid. It is the system. And not to think too narrowly about industry doing that or government doing that, but thinking of the big picture and what this allows us to be innovative, creative, and therefore sustainable in the long term. So you've got to have that broader structure in place. Otherwise, I think you're screwed, to use a technical term.
Thank you. Can I add?
Tack.
Any questions? Yes, please. Yes. No.
Hi, my name is Guðrún Þóra from Hólar University College. Thank you very much for very provoking and thought-provoking presentation. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the term intellectual capital and how you see that in the...
Intellectual capital?
Yeah,
yeah,
and in relation to the destination development.
Basically, intellectual capital refers to how smart your tourism workforce is, or your workforce is, full stop. I mean, it's as simple as that, intellectual capital. And I think the intellectual capital comes from having a good university system, having a good ongoing continuing education system, which we need these days in light of a rapidly changing world, being able to engage in the education. I think it also means, I think very, very importantly, able to have good knowledge transfer between the universities, the research centres and industry, and it has to be a two-way relationship. It really has to be a two-way relationship, because one of the problems I sometimes find is that industry are really keen on getting information, but you say, okay, we have to share this two ways. And then they start getting worried about IP or their competitors finding out what they're doing. Now, there are ways of being able to manage that. But if you have an environment in which you have that nice two-way movement of material, and you could then have a situation as well in which researchers and others have an incentive to provide information to the industry and are rewarded for that, I think it's a real positive. And one of the issues that when I gave a talk at the university on Monday is that one of the things that has happened, and same in my country, is that as an academic, you're getting rewarded in terms of points for certain types of publications. Okay? And the universities want to go up world rankings. The problem is the only publications that make any difference in terms of world rankings are ones that are going to be in English, and they are ones that are also going to be in certain journals. That means that that information does not get to industry. So the challenge, therefore, in terms of government and university and research settings is changing the reward system so that the university staff are rewarded for publishing in their own language, so that it gets to the industry and to the wider public, and that they are also rewarded for publishing more popular items as well. I'm not saying instead of, but as well. If you can do that, then you can get knowledge transfer. You will not get good knowledge transfer unless you do that, because it means academics are otherwise behaving very, very rationally and following the money. So if you want the academics and researchers to really ensure that that information gets back to you, change the bloody system, because it won't work otherwise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're not gone yet. We have one more question up there.
Sorry, Michael. It's me, Edward Hybens, and I just wanted to quick comment and then a question for you. As to the knowledge transfer and the mechanism of knowledge transfer, indeed, I do concur with you on the changing the academic system. It doesn't really work in the favor of industry, that's for sure, the bean counting and point ranking system we have. However, the industry is also sitting on a pile of information that is never actually getting into academia. So as businesses do often, they tend to sit on that. So we have to facilitate knowledge transfer for sure. However, the question I have, it seems to me, and thank you again for a very refreshing sort of no bullshit talk. Very refreshing to listen to this. The question has to do with future prospects. You hinted at some of these issues. You said not to focus on long haul markets because possibly our future will be different. Can you speculate a little bit about our future challenges? What might they be? Just to give an indication of this with no responsibilities attached. Just think with us, please.
I think future prospects for Iceland are actually very good in a number of different ways, because it depends over what time scale we're looking. But if you believe, and I certainly do, some of the issues to do with climate change and particularly the regulatory structures that may be put in place as a relatively short-haul destination in Europe, then that has to be a good thing for Iceland. But I think one of the issues that Iceland faces is really thinking about on what basis is it competing and what is the market. I would be slightly concerned, and I think the minister said something along these lines, in terms of the rapid rate of growth. You know, it really is something to be a bit worried about, because if you lose control of that and you start getting dissatisfaction, whether it's from the community or the wider tourist market, that creates problems. I actually would be looking at a slower rate of growth and charging more. I don't think you charge enough for the product that you have, basically. And I'd also say, if you're ever just going to compete on price, you've got problems. That's not what you want to be focusing on. But I think going for some of those high value niche markets is the way to go. I wouldn't be bothering about the cruise ships whatsoever. I would want to do a proper full accounting of the cruise ships. In some cases it may be worthwhile, in others I'm honestly not so sure. But one of the things actually I really would do, and this gets back to why cruise ships could be good, is one of the things that isn't done enough is a really good long-term tracking of your visitors and their return rates and how often they come back and why. And that's why I say, well, if you're really doing a much better accounting of your cruise ship visitors, that may be a bit different, because if you have a proportion coming back again, repeat visits are the best, aren't they? So if you have people coming back again, I think that could be good value, but you need to be having a research program in place that tracks that. But in the long run, it's focusing on the yield, not price.